Toad, a voice echoes. Oh, wait, hold up.
Explain yourself, Toad.
A voice echoes. Elon gasps and turns to see the king, sword in hand.
I seek out dungeon and the gold within it,
She demands. The king raises his sword.
The lizard woman is blind. She does not see. The very walls that surround us are my dungeon, and as such you are now my prisoner.
The king replies.
your prisoner.
The words slip from Elon's lips. Confounded, she thinks to herself.
What does he mean? Dungeon? I could have sworn this was the throne room. The banners in the wall, the throne, the king. I must surely reconsider what I call a dungeon if I am to escape with my life.
What is a dungeon? You don't know, do you? That's fine. No one does. Take a moment and attempt to define in your mind that crucial word. Dungeon. Hold it in your mind. Dungeon. Make it your mantra. Dungeon. Whisper it as you lie in bed awake, counting to yourself. Dungeon, dungeon, dungeon. Now, I repeat the question. What is a dungeon? We take for granted the all too common representations of them. Cobblestone, yes. Torchlight, yes. Glorified brick-laden basements of humble rural abodes. Yeah. But dungeons can also be the ancient catacombs of phantasmagoric cathedrals. Dungeons can be natural cave formations turned into mines, turned once again into bases for wily goblins. Dungeons can even be the innards of a behemoth with flesh for walls and cascading stomachs and digestive tracts to explore. Consider the dungeons that exist today. Take, for example, a modern-day cell block. Oppressive iron bars enabling the imperialist tradition of slavery. Cage after cage of imprisoned drug dealers and thieves held in captivity for their failings, and the failings of their inflicting society. Stretch your imagination further. A dungeon can be an uncomfortable family gathering where you're forced into conversation with a distant relation whose breath reeks of still wine, but you can't leave since you're trapped. Just like your school cafeteria or physical education class, and they're also dungeons. Like Aelon the Toad Woman learned in our story above, we now know dungeons are not always what we expect. Ultimately, dungeons are any area designed to trap and imprison living beings. They can take many forms, but generally they have 4 walls, a roof, a floor, and an entrance that can be sealed or locked. The material and location do not matter. You'll have to shed your expectations and limitations if you want to escape the dungeons of your enemies, or design the dungeons of your dreams. What isn't a dungeon? That's going to be important. So let's make sure we learn about this shit. After broaching the topic of dungeons to some respected colleagues, it has come to my attention that there are in fact some things which are not dungeons. These are not dungeons. Porches and gazebos. Small things that move. Cars, carriages, wagons, boats, trains. Outside. Roofs. Fenced off areas. Coned off areas. Shaded areas. Cages, although cages can be in dungeons. Trenches, pits, and holes. Nets. Boxes. Water, except when turned into ice. Note, only if the above are considered as a raw construction material can they be turned into a dungeon, i.e. ice Dungeons and Dragons, walls constructed from nets, etc. Okay, well, thanks for the tip. Who are you and what history do you have with dungeons? Are you ready for more? Are you more confident that you know enough facts about dungeons? If so, it's time to figure out who you are and your relation to the dungeon in question. It's no secret that medieval life was difficult. Most peasants spent half of their life just trying to avoid being tossed into the dungeon, spending the other half of their life working their way up through the feudal system. Unlike most people who lived in the medieval times, you do not have to play this as a peasant. You're creating this dungeon now, but this does not mean you're the owner of the dungeon. We will explain the dynamics of this momentarily. So, who are you? You will play this as one of these 4 character types, each having their own particular way of interacting with the dungeons. I'll read them all now, but I'll explain them in order. They are Dungeon Keeper, Dungeon Prisoner, Dungeon Explorer, and Dungeon Lord. I think that's pretty neat, if you ask me. Dungeon Keeper. The boots on the ground. The boots on the ground of the dungeon. A dungeon keeper does all the hard work needed to keep the wheels greased and the prisoners screaming. For smaller dungeons, the dungeon keeper might do all the work, from the jailing to the torch lighting to the safekeeping of treasures. As dungeons scale up, dungeon keeper can evolve into a myriad of positions, often either overseeing or working alongside torturers, ticklers, jailers, miners, beast tamers, beast catchers, and sorcerers. And who else but a flawed individual would voluntarily take to the depths of these dungeons? You might become a dungeon keeper who spends all your time concerned with a very large pile of gold, or a very rowdy crew of inmates. Either way, it's important that you remember the bottom line over your other. Fuck. Hang on, let me take a sip of water here. Well, try. Remember, hydration is very important. Big fan. Big fan. Okay. Let's see. And who else but a flawed individual would voluntarily take the depths of these dungeons? You might become a dungeon keeper who spends all of your time concerned with a very large pile of gold or a very rowdy crew of inmates. Either way, it's important that you remember the bottom line over your own selfish ambitions. A dungeon keeper is the keeper of the dungeon. Dungeon prisoner. An occupant of a dungeon, but not in a good way. Dungeon prisoners can take many forms. Perhaps you're a political prisoner, a tortured enemy, or an insolvent serf. Depending on your approach, you can also play a myriad of non-human dungeon prisoners, including dragons, Sasquai, goblins, or wolves. Suffice it to say that if you're a prisoner in a dungeon, then something hasn't gone well for you in life. Your main goal for being a dungeon prisoner is almost always to stop being a prisoner in a dungeon, whether by escaping, earning a pardon, or politically maneuvering your way into joining the Dungeon Keeper's team. Dungeon Explorer. This is the ultimate dungeon outsider. Literally. A Dungeon Explorer has no official association with the dungeon, while also needing something from the dungeon. Like turning the page. These are both noble and ignoble. There's an IG before noble, so it's like, yeah, you get it. Ignoble reasons to be a dungeon explorer. Perhaps you are there to rescue an old friend from the black cells, or perhaps for gold or the Holy Grail or a portal to another world. Don't automatically assume dungeon explorers are honorable heroes. Like all 4 major dungeon characters, they almost always have something nefarious and shifty in their backstory. Otherwise, they'd be a normal adventurer meandering among pyramids or through nature and waterfalls, with little direction and certainly no gain. Hikers, if you will. Something dangerous draws people to dungeons. Think of something exciting, motivated. Damn it. Think of some exciting motives. spooky backstories, and nefarious traits for your dungeon explorer. Dungeon Lord. A person who owns a dungeon. You want a dungeon, but frankly have no time to design one or oversee its upkeep. That's fine. Your shadow self is happy to take this role over as its dungeon keeper. A lord is the biggest deal in his or her particular jurisdiction. The man writing the checks so that everyone in the dungeon is fed and starved at the appropriate levels. That the torch lamps will stay lit without doing any of the lighting yourself. And that no one dies in the dungeon, except for all the specific situations which someone needs to die. Being a dungeon lord is not too different than the contemporary president of the United States. School district. Why is it so hard to read after you've been reading for so long? School district superintendent, or CEO of a prison. You're doing the tough work, but often disconnected from the day-to-day grind, right up until things go off the rails and you're forced to jump in. Obviously, the Dungeon Lord is also the character type who spends the least amount of time in dungeons, unless you have a penchant for micromanagement. So, which dungeon person are you? By now you've probably decided which one you'll be. It's up to you to craft a realistic persona of your character, but don't go too far yet. You've yet a few more aspects of your character to iron out before you step in. Prisoners and explorers. The prisoners line the walls. They look as if they've been here for ages. Their beards thick, their garments rags, their eyes tired and unseeing. I'm not going to do the voice again.
I'm Aelon, and I'm here to save you from the terrible enemy who has trapped you here.
The hero announces.
We do not deserve to be saved,
They whisper.
You should not be here.
Wait, oh. You should not be here, a voice says from behind Aelon. She whirls to see a giant knight, surely 8 feet tall, holding a gold sword.
I am the keeper of this dungeon, and you are not welcome here.
I thought all keepers of dungeons were ghouls and freaks,
says the heroic Aelon.
Then it seems that you still have far too limited perspective on a nuanced situation,
says the dungeon keeper. Additional questions and details about your dungeon life. What are your daily tasks like? Within the confines of this game, the dungeon looms above all. The Lord worries about enemies and payments. The Keeper worries about much the same, but from a different angle. The prisoner knows nothing beyond this dungeon, worried it may be where his or her journey ends. The explorer once knew other things before plunging into the belly of the underground beast. What do you do on a daily basis? What minute M-I-N-U-T-I-A-E spells that word. Consume your life. If a dungeon keeper, it ranges from the dungeon's mood curation to the feeding of the prisoners. If the Lord, you may be consumed with the making lists of enemies and determining how to get them into your dungeon. An explorer probably had a journey to get into the dungeon and now journeys within. The prisoner does not have much control over daily life, but you have to imagine it nonetheless. When did the dungeon become the most important aspect of your character's life? You were once an ordinary person. You had hopes and dreams before this place. Perhaps it was a sudden shift, or perhaps you gradually went from one life to another. The dungeon slowly consuming your waking life and your dreams. Unless you were a child born in this dungeon, which perhaps you were, and then you must sculpt a life story around that fact. How did you hear about this dungeon, or what event inspired you to create it? What's at stake if you aren't able to fulfill your duty as dungeon keeper? Or what crimes were you imprisoned here? Ask yourself, for how long has this been the world I know? What did you do before the dungeon began consuming your life? Remember when you had a normal life? What was it? Beekeeper? Peasant? Non-dungeon lord? How many dungeons have you been before this one? How does this compare? Are you a dungeon connoisseur, or is this new for you? Have you visited one dungeon or thousands? What were they like, and how does this one differ? It's good to know these questions as they'll inform your behavior during your time in the dungeons. How do you generally feel about dungeons? Or are they places you enjoy? Are they unpleasant for you? If you were locked in a dungeon cell with a group of strangers, how long before you turned to murder and cannibalism to keep yourself alive? This is always an important question, both in this game and in others you might play with you. What? Nope, let's read that differently again. Um, that is always an important question, both in this game and any other you may play. Yeah, very, very true. Good point. Take a sip of water because your tongue is dry AF. Heck yeah. Okay. What was the first dungeon you visited, and how did it inform the rest of your life moving forward? As we walked before... Nope. God damn, I'm fucking up everything. As we asked before, what is your history with dungeons? But specifically, recall the dungeon you visited as a child, or that perhaps you were born into. Recall the black mold on the sleek stones, the rattling chains, the wind howling from down the towers above, and the other winds howling up from the deep chasm below the corridors through which you walked. You still carry that dungeon with you today. You will carry that dungeon with you always. Sorry, I moved it a little bit. Enter the Shadow Self. It's time to start adding in some details to the dungeon itself. If you want this game to go well, you need to know the facts of the dungeon. But, you might say, how can I know these facts if I'm the dungeon explorer? Is it not unfair for me to have such information? Or, if I'm the dungeon lord, why am I concerned with such details? I want a dungeon and don't bog me down with details. Or, what is maybe such an informed dungeon prisoner? Good question, all of those. At least, until you consider how wrong those questions are. These questions must be answered. How else will you play the game? The trouble is that, yes, for you to know the answers will complicate things. It will strip away mystery and intrigue and add a confused layer of grime over the entirety of the tale. So you must play correctly. No longer a silly game. While we do have some important facts to figure out, it's crucial that you put your shadow self to better use in this game than you have ever done before. You may recall a game I taught you once ages ago, where you face off against a small sliver of yourself, where you face your own shadow and hide something from it. We read about that, chat, remember? You've done things like this throughout the other games you've played, of course, but for this game, you must do it again, and on a higher level. If you are to play as an explorer or prisoner, then your shadow self must be the keeper and the lord. If you are the lord or keeper, then your shadow self plays the explorer and the prisoner. This is how it goes. Draw upon the realms that exist within yourself, and play this frightening game. Crafting a dungeon experience. Ooh. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, we have to determine some facts about the dungeon. What kind of dungeon is it? Seriously, what's the end game of this thing? Just a place to keep prisoners? A place to torture prisoners? A kill them? A place to keep terrible beasts? A place to hide treasures? A place to even score with that one demon? Whoa. It could be a sex dungeon. What the fuck? Get the best idea you can. What is this purpose today? What was its purpose originally? Or where is it headed? Note, upon answering this question, you may wish to scrap your previous conception of your dungeon and start anew. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. What's the mood like? While dungeons skew dreary, it's important to get the most crisp and clear idea of the mood that you can. Really close your eyes and reach a thorough envisioning of the exact experience of being in this dungeon, Sounds, smells, sights. Do you want distant wails of despair echoing through the corridors from prisoners? Or will the subtle moaning of lost spirits suffice? A quiet resting place for the dead, or bustling with day-to-day traffic and chained prisoners? Will your cages rest on the ground, or will they sway in the air? Ideally, this mood will send a strong message saying watch out to anyone who dares to enter it. Where is my dungeon? Visualize the general political climate and geography in the area around it. Are you in Germany, Prussia, some foreign land that never existed, fantasy world in another realm, Peru, Quebec, anime? I added the anime part, I'll be real. When is the dungeon? Sure, this thing could have a medieval theme, but it does not have to be a true medieval times. Sure, dungeons peaked during the medieval ages, but their charm is timeless. Is it 5,000 years ago? 10,000? 200? Is this a tale from the Byzantine dungeons of 1066 or the dungeons of the French Revolution? The futuristic dungeons of the derelict prison vessel floating through space? What treasures are hidden in this dungeon? What ghosts haunt it? What ghouls walk the walls? Always fun questions to answer. Choosing a dungeon scenario. It's not easy being a warrior. And here at the end of her life, it seems that Aelin has ended up in chains and is doomed to die. She reaches for her food, beyond her grasp once again. She used to hear the screams of the other prisoners, but not anymore. Perhaps there is no one left in this dungeon, not even its frightening keeper. But then, aha! She remembers hearing that this dungeon contains a ghost who grants wishes to the dying. If only she can get close enough to death that she can make the wish. I've arrived, Aelin, says the princess ghost of the forbidden dungeon. Now, sister, tell me your wish. And so, you now have the tools at your disposal, in which you will create an enthralling dungeon experience. There are two major baselines, both of which we've established by now, that you must cling to as you play this game. Beyond that, things are pretty flexible. To reiterate, there must be a dungeon which you have conceived as either yourself or your shadow self. And two, you must have a connection to the dungeon, either as its lord, keeper, prisoner, or explorer. Now we ask the most important question, and this is in bold, so that's how you know it's real serious. Are you capable of conceiving and constructing a sprawling dungeon, memorizing each and every corner and trap and also the greater world with each rhyme and reason to which it exists, all within the confines of your mind and memory? No, while disappointing, it's still an answer that I have accounted for. Since you are unable to conceive a scenario in which your dungeon is built, consider utilizing one of the scenarios that I've concocted, and can vouch for as intelligent, thoughtful, inspiring premises for your first dungeon adventure. Religious theme scenarios. The Holy Grail is in the dungeon. Demon asked to keep a prisoner in the dungeon momentarily. Really bad guys escaping from the dungeon. Religious. Dragon died in the dungeon. Oh. Monster theme scenarios. Really bad guys escaping from the dungeon. A monster guy. Monster mix up the dungeon. Who let the monsters out? Logistics themed scenarios. Too many slaves. Really bad guys escaping from the dungeon. Political prisoner. The dungeon includes a portal to hell that must be sealed off. The dungeon employees have unionized and are striking. We have run out of slaves. A new torture chamber is being added and the funding fell through. Development hell in hell. We are adding in a new wing of the dungeon. A visit from the fire marshal. Ghost themed scenarios. The dungeon is being used to store stolen arts and the art is haunted. Who's moaning? It's just all it says. It's who's moaning. Scenarios inspired by literature. Dracula owns the dungeon. Victor Frankenstein works in the dungeon. A really bad guy is escaping from the dungeon. Frankenstein's monster. Wizard boy in the Tower of London. Scenarios inspired by true events. Exploring the catacombs of Paris. King Tut's treasure is mine. See adventure. Oh, adventure's another adventure we could do. A bunch of Russian letters, a gulag story. A really bad guy is escaping from the dungeon, prison break. My neighbor is acting suspicious. Did you choose? Are you ready? There's only like one paragraph left, chat. A journey into the deep. You're now ready. The tools are at your disposal. You have finally learned what a dungeon is, and what it isn't, and how to truly bring this dungeon to life. Conceive your role, your scenario, and then finally, construct your dungeon. Your shadow self is ready to go, already plotting surprises for you at the other end of everything. This is my signature game. Perhaps not my only signature game, but something I want my enthusiasts to think of whenever they remember me, particularly after my death. Enjoy. Sincerely, J. Theophrastus Bartholomew. Go. Aww. That was cute. I like that. Tell us your dungeon? Oh man. I don't really get much time to think about my dungeon because I was reading it the whole time. Man, what would my dungeon be like? Alright, hold up. I'm gonna close my eyes and think, chat. We're gonna have a think sesh. Okay. My dungeon's got kobold guards. We're patrolling the halls. We got torches, cobwebs up in there. Oh, looking, oh, so good. It's kind of like that one game from, you remember that one game we did that one time with the little mouse? It was kind of like that vibe there. Oh, so good. Ah, oh man. Oh, dude, you should see it. You should see that dungeon. Man. Kobolds. Such jerks. Chap, I love you guys, but I don't know if I can read another one right now because reading continuously for 2 hours is surprisingly strenuous. But that was really fun though. We'll definitely do some more reading streams if you guys are into that. Because I enjoyed it at least. I thought it was a nice chill change of pace at least. Oh god, don't fall. Don't fall. It's not falling. Okay. Hell yeah. Oh, sweet. Nice. Good to hear, chat. Hell yeah. Relaxing streams. Best kind. Now we gotta figure out what to do now. That's the biggest question. You wanna stay with us and play some? I'm down, I'm just not sure what exactly yet. Because I'm not sure. I mean, actually, I do got one thing I could do. Hang on, chat. Let me pull it up again. I got a game we could play. It's a chill game also. So it would be it'd be a good follow-up to what we just did. So we got a good chill game we can do. Okay. Move this over here. That salt lamp did nothing. I'm gonna need to get a reading light, I think, next time we do that. Yeah, I could totally do that. Totally. Oh, we also probably don't need the good reedy boy. But I'm glad I got to finally use it after like a year of sitting on it. That's always